Bordeaux, a city located in the southwest of France, has experienced several golden ages throughout history and is home to many elaborate monuments. These buildings were made to impress. Designed by the greatest architects of the era, they've become true symbols. Among the buildings of Bordeaux, 3 of them allow us to understand how men were able to use the constraints to beautify the city and create monuments with magnificent presence. The Basilica of St. Michael and its spire, the Grand Théâtre, and the Place de la Bourse.
The spire is like a rocket sitting on its launch pad. It's incredibly slender.
The Grand Théâtre is unquestionably one of the most beautiful theaters in the world. No other has 12 freestanding columns, not even the Greek temples.
The Royal Square opens directly onto the Garonne River with absolutely splendid architectural staging.
How was the St. Michael spire built so high? What techniques made it possible to build the Grand Théâtre? And how did the builders construct Place de la Bourse on unstable soil?
The construction site was absolutely hellish. Since it was located right next to the Garonne, they were forced to pump day and night to evacuate the water.
It was one of the largest theaters in Europe in the late 18th century. It was a technological gem at the time.
There were extremely precise constraints, so they had to work about 2 hours to install the dock.
Thanks to the greatest experts on Bordeaux heritage, computer-generated reconstructions, and never-before-seen aerial shots, you're about to learn how these buildings in Bordeaux came to life. This is the story of the construction of 3 of the most beautiful monuments in Bordeaux, dreams of visionary architects and engineers. Bordeaux is located in the southwest of France. It is an open-air museum. Countless monuments bear witness to the architectural history and commercial success of the city. The Grand Théâtre, Place de la Bourse, and the Basilica St. Michael and its huge spire. It was the Middle Ages, halfway through the 14th century. The city was the capital of a principality under English rule. At that time, Bordeaux was surrounded by ramparts. With an area of less than 1 square kilometer, the city was cramped. It was impossible to build large, prestigious monuments. The city would develop outside the walls in the suburbs. One neighborhood in particular experienced rapid development. The St. Michael district with its 20,000 inhabitants.
The local trade was obviously flourishing, especially the wine trade with England. The merchants of St. Michael made their mark from this trade and they got richer. The prosperity of the parish led to the renovation of the building, most likely rebuilt from the second half of the 14th century.
The small parish church no longer reflected the wealth and status of the neighborhood. It was therefore decided to build a monumental church and a huge 114-meter-tall bell tower, the equivalent of a 43-story building. It was the tallest stone monument in Bordeaux and the Kingdom of France, a real architectural challenge.
Because it was the most populated parish of the city, and probably also the richest, it was decided to construct a building in the Gothic style, which was fashionable at the time.
The idea was to build a huge church capable of accommodating nearly 1,000 worshippers. The monument was to measure 14 meters high, with a surface area of 1,400 square meters, the equivalent of more than 7 tennis courts. It was decided to opt for a hall church architecture.
A whole church has 3 aisles of identical height. These are a central aisle flanked by side aisles of the same height.
The hall church has the advantage of being very large. Since the side aisles are very high, you can illuminate the side naves with very large windows.
The construction of this incredible church began early in the 14th century, in 1330. The builders were unaware, but the construction would experience unexpected twists. The project would last 250 years.
When building in the Gothic period, there was always something already in existence, often a Romanesque church, which was the case here. First, the chapel was covered so that worship could continue. It was protected and remained operational.
The future hall church thus wrapped around the pre-existing church. The first step was to delineate the construction and raise the first walls. Once the new chancel was built and protected from water and wind, the old church was gradually demolished, as the 11 pillars were built in the center of the monument. But construction was slow because even though the inhabitants of St. Michael were rich, the times did not favor large-scale construction.
The 14th century brought many dangers. Bordeaux went through floods, land crises, and the plague, which affected the city in 1348. There was also the 100 Years' War that wasn't conducive to any trade development.
The work was slow, but the hall church was finally built a century later, in the year 1430.
The church was 50 meters long by 25 meters wide, in addition to the 3 pentagonal apses on the eastern side. The dimensions were very large for a whole church of this era. I haven't seen any other urban parish church of comparable size from this time period.
While the hall church, composed of 3 identical aisles topped with a roof, was completed a century after the beginning of its construction, a turnaround was about to force the builders to completely reconsider their plan. Architectural standards had evolved. To be considered prestigious, religious monuments had to be bright and slender. The parish council made a radical decision to transform the hall church into a sumptuous basilica and thus increase the volume of the building by 40%.
A basilica-type church has a tall aisle lit directly and laterally by large bay windows. Another type of structure was chosen, one that was more prestigious. It was also extremely ambitious because it meant having to demolish, or at least build on top of what they had just completed.
A basilica church is composed of a high aisle in the center, surrounded by side aisles. The goal was to narrow the new basilica by building on the walls of the hall church. This was a real technical challenge, as the works aimed at doubling the height of the monument. These changes to the megastructure would upset the forces at stake.
In terms of balance of forces, they had to compensate for the lowering of the side aisles with flying buttresses that made up for the buttresses that were lost.
Initially, the 3 aisles of the same height compensated for the forces on all sides. As soon as the center aisle was raised, the weight was concentrated in the middle, and colossal vertical pressure threatened the lateral structures. To prevent the walls from giving way, 18 flying buttresses were installed on the outside. They supported the tens of tons of pressure from the tall aisle and allowed to stabilize the basilica. This transformation of the structure required significant know-how and 125 years of construction. While the builders had anticipated the need for immense flying buttresses, they did not foresee an element that threatened the collapse of the church 4 centuries later. It was in the middle of the French Revolution, and the pillars were a genuine concern.
The weakness of the pillars after the fact can be explained. When they went from the Rayonnant Gothic style to the flamboyant Gothic style, they used the same pillar profile and thickness that were suitable for a 14-meter-high church, not a 24-meter one.
The walls and pillars of the basilica, originally intended to support the weight of the hall church, were not resized for the new building. Over time, they started to bend and twist.
The weight of the vaults of the tall aisle created buckling, a bulge toward the inside of the building. This phenomenon was due to the weight of the aisle, but also to the lateral force of the vaults of the side aisles.
For the 3rd time in its history, the church had to be completely redesigned and rebuilt. 1/3 of the monument was demolished, the 6 pillars of the radiating chapel as well as the vaults. The basement was also dug to a depth of more than 8 meters to provide new foundations. But the proximity of the river and the high tides complicated matters.
The construction site was absolutely hellish. Since they were right beside the Garonne, it was the middle of winter, and they were forced to pump day and night to evacuate the water. Then gradually, between 1860 and 1864, they rebuilt the pillars in a slightly different shape. They were widened and thickened. They also tried to rectify some of the problems.
Generations of master craftsmen were challenged in the construction of this majestic basilica. But to show the residents of Bordeaux and the world the power and wealth of St. Michael, the parish planned, from the beginning, the erection of a huge tower, one that would measure more than 100 meters tall. At the time, such height was beyond comprehension. In the 14th century, the tallest building in Bordeaux was the Cathedral of St. Andrew, with its Pays Berlin Tower. It was this building, located 1 kilometer from the St. Michael district, that the builders wished to surpass. The tower was 66 meters tall, the equivalent of a 25-story building. Their aim was to almost double that height. To achieve their goal, the engineers knew they had to detach the building from the basilica.
In Romanesque times, a large bell tower porch was attached to the Cathedral of St. Andrew, which very quickly tipped over. As a result, when it came time to rebuild a large bell tower, it was decided to detach it from the church in order to provide it with its own foundations.
The bigger the spire, the better it is to separate it. We're talking about a very large weight. It was better for the bell tower to be separate from the church and the church to be separate from the bell tower.
The tower was hence built 15 meters from the basilica. The year was 1472, and construction went on for 20 years. The idea was to build 6 massive arches to support it. It reached a height of 114 meters, the equivalent of a 43-story building. For the tower to remain steady, they had to create a solid foundation. But at that location, it seemed impossible.
It weighed thousands of tons, so building near the river wasn't ideal. The riverside was composed of silt and it was soft. The difficulty was building something so high on a type of ground that was not very well understood. It was already very daring to build a structure 120 meters tall, almost as high as the pyramids.
The Great Pyramid of Giza in Egypt is 146 meters high, with sides measuring 230 meters. Its footprint is colossal, 53,000 square meters, the equivalent of more than 7 soccer fields. Meanwhile, the spire of St. Michael was 114 meters high and only 20 meters in diameter. Such a thing had never been attempted before. The construction was beyond belief.
The whole challenge was to support the spire. To put it simply, the tower was made up of buttresses, around which a stone skin was placed, the stones being as light as possible.
To meet the challenge, the builders constructed 3 separate parts. They began by installing 6 massive arches anchored in the ground only a few meters deep. The arches were 45 meters in height and formed the base of a tower. These foundations weighed 5,000 tons. The second step was the construction of the tambour. Huge cranes were used to build it.
The crane was placed inside the building because the tower was completely hollow. That way, the men and the materials went through the center of the building, which was less expensive than erecting huge scaffolding outside.
Large blocks were lifted up very high, and the structure grew taller and taller. It was built in much the same way as skyscrapers were in New York in the 1930s.
Once the tambour was erected, the uppermost, most delicate part was built. Exterior scaffolding surrounded the spire. At the top, a crane distributed the stones. The whole structure rose as the construction progressed. It was a genuine stone skin, stretched from the tambour to the top, a work of art at over 100 meters in altitude.
At their thinnest point, the stone facets were 15 centimeters thick. We're talking about something absolutely amazing.
These stones had to be as light as possible, yet able to withstand the weather. At this height, the wind can blow at gusts of 250 kilometers per hour. To ensure that the spire was properly supported, the stones were all secured.
The stones were sealed together with metal staples, small pieces that were also covered with lead to protect from corrosion. The higher you got, the more metal elements were present. In the last centuries of the Middle Ages, Gothic architecture evolved to use more than stone and glass. Iron also came into play.
The complexity of the construction and the work of the laborers at such a height took 20 years to complete. It wasn't until 1492 that the spire was sealed at the top of the tower. But immediately, the building terrified the residents of Bordeaux.
It was like a rocket on its launch pad. It was incredibly slender. It was so extraordinary that everyone nearby was very worried. They were afraid it would fall on them. They said they couldn't sleep at night for fear the spire would crack. The whole endeavor was completely crazy.
That fear was justified as the builders tested the limits of physics. They gave themselves no security margin, meaning that at the slightest storm, the building threatened to tip over.
You have to imagine that when you have something so slender, a force applied horizontally at the top results in 15 times as much at the bottom. There's a considerable multiplier effect.
The windage was so colossal that the spire eventually collapsed. The top of the tower was rebuilt. Imposing buttresses reinforced the base of the building so that the bell tower of St. Michael could continue to stand proudly in the Bordeaux sky.
The bell tower was visible several dozen kilometers from the countryside. It was higher than the roofs of the city and all other buildings in the region. When you arrived in Bordeaux by boat through the estuary, what you saw from the bow of the ship was the spire of St. Michael. It set the tone of the city.
Even today, more than 7 centuries after its construction, the St. Michael Tower remains the tallest monument in the city and one of its symbols. But a majestic construction would soon give the city a new dimension and international flair. The famous Grand Théâtre. The year was 1773. A powerful man offered Bordeaux one of its most beautiful monuments ever built. The governor, Maréchal Duc de Richelieu, an habitué of the court of King Louis XV, was a theater enthusiast. He wanted to provide the city with a majestic resort for entertainment. To do so, he called upon a great architect trained at the prestigious academy in Rome, Victor Louis.
Victor Louis was an architect who was almost 40 years old and had an extremely interesting resume.
The Château Trompette was a huge building owned by the king and located north of Bordeaux. It was here, on this virgin land connected by Versailles, that Victor Louis planned to build his monument.
The location was ideal. It wasn't far from the river, which made it possible to transport the construction materials via water, a much simpler way than by land.
At first glance, all the elements were present to allow this majestic edifice to be built quickly. Yet the construction would challenge the architect.
The work started at the end of 1773. He planned to complete construction in about 3 years or so, as was the general rule for a theater. However, it took nearly 7 years.
The location on the shores of the Garonne River, originally seen to be an advantage, ultimately proved to be a major inconvenience.
Everything went well with the classic stone foundations up to 60 or 65 meters. But the last few 20 to 25 meters were problematic because the stable base of the Place de Comédie gave way to a significantly looser and muddier ground.
The theater was located in a swampy area with streams and marshes in which the tide rose constantly. Bordeaux has an extremely large tidal range, even though the city is more than 80 kilometers from the sea.
The first idea was to use a considerable amount of earth and rock to try to dry out the ground. But the power of the water of the Garonne made this solution impossible. The only alternative was to build the theater on stilts.
Louis lined the basement of his theater with these stilts that helped maintain the stability of the building. They bore a good deal of the weight above, in addition to the stone foundations. These stilts also played a role in the fluctuation of humidity in the basement, without impacting the stability of the building.
The western part was made up of a stone floor, but to the east, near the Garonne, the land was totally muddy. There was even an underground steam present. As a remedy, Victor Louis installed 240 stilts up to 15 meters deep in places. They created a huge mesh structure spanning 1,300 square meters. the equivalent of 5 tennis courts.
They were able to start setting up the 2 cellar floors of the Grand Théâtre. It was a colossal job at the beginning to ensure the stability and solidity of the building.
200 men tackled this tedious job. Construction was so expensive that after 1 year of work, the stilts were barely installed and the coffers were empty. The construction stopped due to a lack of money. New funding had to be secured before Victor Louis could continue to work on the monument. The architect had an obsession. He wanted the theater to be entirely built of stones. As a result, the layout and quality of each one was meticulously thought out.
There were quarries throughout the southwest from which Victor Louis was able to choose. Stones were chosen according to the attributes necessary for their position to maintain the stability of the building.
The strongest stones were used for pedestals, stair steps, and for the first cut stone foundations, up to about 80 centimeters from the ground.
For the higher parts of the building, he chose limestone with a similar aesthetic, but much lighter in weight and much less dense, which contributed to its stability.
4 varieties of stone were intelligently distributed throughout the building. Victor Louis' goal was to hold these thousands of stones together without the slightest artifice.
Stacking the stones was a bit like playing with Legos. Victor Louis was a genius of stereotomy, the art of stone cutting, in such a way that the building holds together without metallic assistance.
Louis used stone as much as possible in order to avoid the risk of fire. The construction was so meticulous that it was a masterpiece.
To make the monument even more grandiose, Victor Louis gave himself a technical challenge that no architect had ever attempted. He wanted to build an overhang with 12 columns. The year was 1776.
No building in the world had 12 free columns. The Greek temples themselves didn't even have that. It was assumed that the 12 columns on the front couldn't hold without being buttressed at the corners. It created a problem of tangential thrust and outward thrust. Naturally, his contemporaries said it was impossible to achieve.
A flat vault is a very fragile architectural element that's stabilized with stones that are cut in such a way that the forces are distributed until they're stopped by lateral walls. But since this was the front of the building, there were no lateral walls. This really puzzled the people of Bordeaux, who were aware of the technical difficulty and thought the vault would never hold.
This 12-column overhang created colossal forces toward the outside of the monument. If nothing was done, the outer columns could collapse, taking a chunk of the theater in their fall. One of the possibilities was to balance these forces with buttresses, but Victor Louis wanted to leave the columns totally free. He then found an effective and imperceptible trick.
When you observe the structure of the flat vault that holds without any lateral walls to stop the thrust, you realize that there's a beautiful series of cut stones that naturally redirect the thrust towards the facade of the building.
At the ends of the colonnade, the stones were carved and interwoven using a technique known as dovetailing, traditionally used in carpentry, but applied here to stones.
They were fitted together in the corners. He did that not only for the last column, but for the last two columns, which diffused the thrust that was carried back, so to speak, to the wall of the theater itself, behind the portico. And as a result, it didn't move.
The layout was composed of 78 stones cut to redistribute and redirect the forces towards the facade of the wall, which was stable. But the residents were wary of this technique. To reassure them, Victor Louis installed an iron frame to further secure the building.
Some thought it was useful, others thought it was a joke and called it Victor Louis' nail. It was one of the only metal pieces used in the building. All the rest was the result of his ability to cut and place the stones in a functioning layout without the use of metal.
While the monument's exterior was astonishing, its interior captivated the nobility of the era. Spectators descended their carriages under the portico before entering the building.
They entered a rectangular vestibule with columns, which was rather low and dark, by the way. From this vestibule, through the archways, a bright part was visible in the center. It was the stairwell, which was an absolute masterpiece.
The masterful entrance was designed like a theater set. Its architecture and lighting had only one goal: to showcase the spectators and give the impression of luxury and grandeur.
The staircase was obviously used to go from one level to another, but it also served as a stage for the aristocracy. As a result, the steps were wide, the banisters were low, and one could admire the outfits of the aristocrats who climbed the stairs. A century later, while designing the staircase of the Palais Garnier in Paris, Charles Garnier said he owed a debt to Victor Louis for inspiring the concept behind his own staircase, even though the goal was then no longer to highlight the aristocracy, but the triumphant bourgeoisie instead.
While the staircase of the Bordeaux Opera was fascinating, it was also due to the monumental vault that overlooked it. 13 openings flooded the entire space with light, from the stairs to the ceiling. It's hard to notice, but an optical illusion gives the impression of a much larger volume than what actually exists.
Victor Louis created the building in such a way that it gave the impression of much more grandeur and elevation than existed in reality. The columns don't have parallel edges. They narrow at the top, playing with the perspective. The domed vault above is decorated with rosettes. The larger one is at the bottom, and the higher you go toward the center of the dome, the smaller the rosettes, which gives the impression that the domed vault is higher than it actually is.
After climbing the stairs, the spectators walked to the heart of the monument, the concert hall. Unlike the rest of the building, this jewel was built entirely of wood. Victor Louis compared the room to the interior of a musical instrument.
It is undoubtedly one of the most beautiful theaters in the world, because first of all, its volume is quite exceptional. It became a monument, so it was in Louis's mind. He considered it his masterpiece.
The richly decorated room could accommodate 1,100 spectators. But what the audience didn't see was that above and behind the stage curtain, the large backstage area it a complex mechanism.
It was one of the largest theaters in Europe at the end of the 18th century. It was at the forefront of technological modernity. The layout created a kind of balance, but it also provided the theater with an extraordinarily large stage using a very complex and sophisticated machinery that made it a technological jewel.
Above the concert hall was a gigantic space, the painter's room. This is where the sets were created. This room was revolutionary because the canvases were usually painted in external workshops and then rolled up and transported to the theater. From that point on, the sets were painted just above the stage.
They only had to drag them a few meters to place them above the stage, where they were attached to poles and simply fell into place. As a result, the canvases were moved a mere 15 meters. This is another example of the extraordinary modernity of this building at the end of the 18th century.
The huge performance hall only occupied a small part of the building. The mechanisms dedicated to the sets took up the majority of the space. In order for them to appear and disappear, the volume above and below had to be as large as that of the gigantic stage, which measured 10 meters in height, 16 meters in width, and 25 meters in depth, a volume bigger than that of an Olympic-sized swimming pool. It was impossible to see from the performance hall, but these unusual dimensions concealed 13 rows of sets operated by a system of ropes and wagons on rails.
These trolleys had a triangular shape. There was an arm that passed through the stage floor space with the set element attached to it. The carts rolled under the stage, moving the set with them and creating a series of planes. This extraordinary machinery allowed to animate the stage, making the theater one of the most technologically advanced of the late 18th century.
With these complex mechanisms, the sets could appear from all sides and move in all directions. The device above the stage allowed the painted canvases to be lowered and moved vertically and horizontally. The system hidden under the stage allowed the sets to appear from the floor and move across the entire width. These mechanisms were revolutionary at the time. Inaugurated in 1780, the Grand Théâtre became a symbol of modernity and an architectural reference that truly marked the advent of a new Bordeaux.
The appearance of the Bordeaux of the future was somewhat decided by the specific placement of the Grand Theatre.
From the beginning, Louis designed his theater as a fundamental element of the Bordeaux of tomorrow.
While the Grand Théâtre was a symbol of the wealth and new power of the city, the construction of a square worthy of Versailles would allow Bordeaux to open the city to the world for the first time in history. It was the beginning of the 18th century, in the middle of the Age of Enlightenment. For over 400 years, Bordeaux had been surrounded by ramparts and wanted to depart from its image as a dark medieval city.
Bordeaux was still a city of half-timberings, a city that was partly made of wood, and therefore the defenses imposed by the military gave a sterile look to a large part of it.
The image we have of the city at that time was a predominantly fortified city, a medieval city, which, in the 18th century, did not affirm its richness or modernity.
Bordeaux's image was no longer in line with its international reach. At that time, the city was the second largest commercial port in the world, just behind London.
There were 300 or 400 ships in front of the port of Bordeaux, in 2 or 3 rows. Therefore, the port attracted a lot of capital, which was synonymous with construction possibilities. Since the city was very attractive, there were a lot of migrants.
Between 1715 and 1790, the city went from 45,000 to 120,000 inhabitants, a growth of 250%.
It was the highest rate of urban growth in all of France.
Bordeaux experienced a golden age and unprecedented population growth. It became urgent to provide the city with a monument with modern architecture, visible to all, and symbolizing the new economic power and presence of the city.
It was important for trade and competition with other cities, which had already implemented characteristics of this new architecture. At the time, there was a sort of urban competition, which led to the desire to recreate the city. They had to demolish the ancient iconography and jump headfirst into this new architecture in order to create a resolutely contemporary city.
It was hence decided to build an extraordinary royal square in honor of King Louis XV. But to have a real impact, the square had to be built in a strategic place that was visible to all, even if it meant picking a location considered impossible to build on. At that time, one of the main entrances to the city was Via de Garonne, the huge river that ran through Bordeaux.
When arriving in Bordeaux from the north of France, you inevitably cross the river. Similarly, when foreigners reach the city, they would arrive through the estuary and then go up the river. That's why the Royal Square was going to be a window into the city that would reflect the prosperity of the port.
It was here, at the exact spot where the Garonne curved, that Place de la Bourse would be erected. It was an ideal location to catch the eye of travelers, making this space the new nerve center of Bordeaux. The Royal Square promised to be a huge space of 12,000 square meters, the equivalent of 45 tennis courts, surrounded by prestigious monuments on one side and the Garonne on the other. To gain space, the square had to go beyond the walls and over the river, which was unthinkable at the time.
The parliament stated that building a wharf on the river would cause sand to move in the riverbed and would therefore hinder navigation. In other words, they wanted the project stopped.
But King Louis XV had no intention of giving up. He sent to Bordeaux one of his architects, Jacques Gabriel, accompanied by engineers. Their objective, to carry out technical surveys in order to prove that the construction of the square would not affect the proper functioning of the port.
One of the first missions of the architect and engineers was to chart the course of the river and then go down with the current in order to gauge the various problems that could occur. From there, they produced a plan that showed that building a dock in front of the square would cause no problem.
The construction of the square began. The year was 1730. The project went on for 25 years. Workers demolished 21 shops and 10 houses. 150 meters of walls were knocked down. To give the square even more grandeur, the challenge was to build a balcony above the Garonne. This step proved to be a real ordeal because the ground was totally unstable and the weather threatened the construction site.
In the 18th century, there was no dock. It was a muddy, dirty bank. Let's not forget that Bordeaux was a very swampy city.
In addition, there were extremely precise constraints, as the city of Bordeaux was built in a place that's affected by the tide. Therefore, they had about 2 hours a day to build the wharf. The contractors had to prepare all the materials they would need to quickly take advantage of the 2 hours daily when the tide was low, so they could install the dock.
Pine stilts measuring 40 centimeters in diameter were sunk to a depth of 7 meters. The stilts were then connected to each other. This structure was extremely strong. The frame was capable of supporting the masonry needed for the construction of the balcony. On the other side of the square, prestigious monuments were erected. To the south, Hôtel de Ferme, intended to levy taxes on goods. To the north, the Palais de la Bourse, a trading center. The other monuments were put up for sale. Surprisingly, only the facades were erected at first. The goal was to attract investors.
A private, extremely prestigious subdivision was planned. It was almost theatrical. A setting to show the beauty of the square to future buyers, in order to incite the purchase of extremely expensive lots.
The monuments were built with the richness of the French style, worthy of the Château de Versailles. But this square and its monuments had a very particular use. Their aim was to highlight the equestrian statue of the king, originally located in the center, in place of the modern-day fountain. The architecture, the dimensions, and the proportions of the monuments were calculated to magnify the statue.
The concept of the royal square was essentially a monumental setting for the bronze equestrian statue of the sovereign. Everything had to be to scale and work to highlight the statue.
There was a relationship between the square, the height of the statue, the base, and the bas reliefs.
The entire height of the square and the scale of the adjacent streets were calculated in relation to the height of the statue. It determined everything. The architecture shouldn't overpower the statue. Instead, it was the statue that had to dominate the architecture.
With the royal square dedicated to the glory of King Louis XV, Bordeaux, for the first time in its history, created a gap in its ramparts and gave the city new impetus. The square began a general beautification and completely recreated the image of the city.
The square created an image and determined the facade of the entire town. Medieval Bordeaux seemed totally inadequate and archaic in comparison to the square. As a result, a similar facade was developed with identical buildings that modestly followed the organization of the royal square.
More than 1 kilometer long, this gigantic facade was built in front of the streets and gates of the Old Town.
You had the facade of the docks, kind of a gigantic screen, but also the entire perimeter of the city, which was formed by squares connected by avenues. It looked huge, simply because the same architect created all of it.
In a matter of 7 centuries of history and construction, Bordeaux went from a cramped town behind ramparts to a glitzy, opulent city. Its architectural setting reveals its economic power and privileged rank among the major cities in the world. The Basilica of Saint Michael, the Grand Théâtre, Place de la Bourse. In their time, these emblematic monuments each redesigned the face of the city. They're the wonderful testimony of the dreams of architects and illustrate how Bordeaux, over the centuries, refined and adapted its image to always be a city in tune with its time.